So there's a lot of opportunities for E&P companies who have financial capital to invest and grow globally. But what we've seen is because there's increased competition for a smaller pool of upstream capex, the upstream investment environment has become really dynamic, especially as host governments have adapted to this new reality since 2014. And we can see evidence of that in a lot of ways, but one of them has to do with licensing rounds. So even by a conservative count, we expect at least 50 bid rounds to occur in 2019. And these are going to put a lot of opportunities on offer, onshore, offshore, in frontier, in emerging, and in mature regions. Now, these offerings are likely to be concentrated in 3 areas, so in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia Pacific. And this is actually quite interesting because these are the 3 areas where the above-ground investment environment has been the most dynamic due to actions taken by host governments. And that's everything from election outcomes to changes in fiscal and contractual terms. And what that means is if you're interested in these opportunities in these regions, you really need an agile benchmarking system to compare the relative attractiveness of these E&P opportunities. Yeah, so of the 3 regions where we have a lot of licensing activity this year, we're really expecting some of the rounds in Africa and Latin America to be hot. Rounds in Asia Pacific are less likely to attract significant investment from IOCs for a range of reasons. On the above ground side, a lot of what would have been the most attractive destinations are at the moment affected by some above ground issues. So in Australia, we have changes to the petroleum rent resource tax and we have upcoming elections. In Malaysia, we have ongoing negotiations between the federal government and Sabah and Sarawak over petroleum rights and taxation. In Indonesia, we have ongoing concerns about the gross split contract. So a lot of these more interesting jurisdictions are working through issues at the moment. There's also some concerns in Asia, of course, regarding resource upside, discovery volumes, but that doesn't mean these rounds won't attract any interest. It's just more likely to be from more niche, regionally focused players. But when we look at Latin America and Africa, things look hotter. So how do we determine if a bid round's going to be hot? Our team's doing some work on that exact question. So we're looking at these 50 plus upcoming rounds based on a number of screening criteria. So how scarce is the opportunity? What's the potential resource upside? What's recent E&P success and discoveries looked like? What's happened with changes to terms? And are there clear pathways for monetization among some other factors? And when we stack all that up, we've pulled out a few candidates that we think are likely to prove to be the hottest rounds of the year. So that would be Ghana, Senegal, Brazil, and Egypt. So there's some different factors supporting each of these countries. In Brazil, we've got 3 tentative rounds scheduled, and the volume of opportunity, both in terms of resource volume and number of blocks, is unparalleled in Latin America, potentially globally. And a lot of the positive reforms made by the previous administration regarding local content, NOC participation have been maintained. So we have the 16th concession round, we have the 6th PSA round, which is likely to attract similar interest to previous pre-salt rounds, even though Petrobras has used its preferential right to operate 3 blocks. And the government's also preparing for the first transfer of rights rounds following a compensation agreement with Petrobras in April. Now, this round would protect potentially quite a lot of interest because of the commercial discoveries on offer and also the fact that these are areas that investors haven't had access to in the past. They've been reserved for the national oil company. Now, developing volumes in these areas will be somewhat tricky in that you have to sign a cooperation agreement with Petrobras if you're a winning bidder that compensates the NOC for its investment to date. And that means that cost recovery ceilings are going to be really important for the success of that round. But we still expect it to bring in quite a lot of interest depending on how those terms develop. In Ghana, we have the country's first bidding round, and successful progress on development and de-risking makes Ghana quite interesting. Now it is going through the typical pathway of an emerging producer where terms are tightening as de-risking and development progresses. So that means the terms for this first round are not quite as attractive as previous agreements, but we still think they remain quite competitive. So we're going to have some higher rent, some higher taxation payments, some higher state participation, but a lot of the key parameters like royalty are still negotiable. So the government's taking a very pragmatic stance. And indeed, it's that pragmatic stance that has helped Ghana move things towards development faster than other frontiers, which definitely works in its favor. Sticking to Africa, we have Senegal as well, which is likely to have its first competitive licensing round launched this year. And there are a few indicators in Senegal's favor. So first, President Sall retained power in the February elections, so we have pro-upstream policy continuity. The country has also amended its petroleum code. It's non-retroactive amendment, and this gives clarity on one hand because we're moving from a concession to a PSC system. We also have a licensing round format in place now. But on the other hand, it does tighten terms a bit. So we do have a mandatory signature bonus. We have 10% carried NOC participation and exploration that could go up to 20 non-carried in appraisal and development. We have some tighter boundaries on cost recovery. We have moved from negotiable to fixed royalties. We'll have an export tax. And all of this adds up to increased government take. But Senegal's average government take for deep water was very competitive before, 53%. So they have room to increase and still remain quite competitive internationally. The government also brought out a local content policy, which requires more active planning by investors, but doesn't introduce any onerous quotas. So that is another positive for Senegal. And finally, if we look at Egypt, Egypt has two rounds, one in the Red Sea, which has become accessible since the resolution of a maritime border dispute with Saudi Arabia. But what's being offered there is on greater scale than what's been open previously. And then we also have a round in the Western Mediterranean where some new seismic information has generated more interest. And on top of that, we have increased flexibility on the terms, so both with regard to bonuses and biddable parameters, which looks quite positive for Egypt given the recent exploration successes there.